There was a moment when you realized it wasn't going to work anymore. Not when the arguments started, not when the distance grew, but in a quiet second, when their name stopped feeling like home and started feeling like memory. And that is where heartbreak truly begins, because the brutal truth about heartbreak is not that someone leaves you. It is that a part of you leaves with them and never comes back the same way again. But here's what most people never want to hear. Heartbreak is not something that happens to you. It is something that changes you permanently, silently, and completely, while you are still trying to act normal. And if you are watching this, still replaying conversations, still checking old messages, still wondering what went wrong, then you are not just healing from loss. You are standing at the edge of an identity collapse. And the strange part is, nobody warns you about this part. They tell you time heals everything. They say you will move on. They say someone better will come. But they never tell you the truth Marcus Aurelius once quietly lived by. You do not lose people. You lose versions of yourself that only existed because of them. And that is why it hurts so deeply. Because what you are missing is not just a person. It is the version of you that only existed when they looked at you a certain way. And now, silence has replaced that mirror. And in that silence, something inside you starts to break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a candle burning out in a room you didn't realize was getting darker. And this is where our story begins. Because if you stay until the end of this video, you will understand something most people never do in their entire lives. Heartbreak is not the end of love. It is the beginning of truth. And truth is far more painful than loss, but also far more powerful. At first, heartbreak feels like losing a person, but that is the first illusion. What you actually lose is a story your mind created, protected, and repeated so many times that it started to feel more real than reality itself. And here's the strange part. Most people don't fall in love with people. They fall in love with potential. They fall in love with what the relationship could become, with the version of the person that exists only in hope, with the future that never arrives. And that is why letting go feels like dying, because you are not just releasing someone, you are releasing an entire imagined future. Carl Jung once suggested that the most dangerous illusions are the ones we never question because they feel emotionally true, and heartbreak is built entirely on that kind of illusion. You remember the good moments, you exaggerate the meaning behind small gestures, you ignore the silence between conversations, and slowly, without noticing, you start building a mythology around a human being. But here's what most people never realize. The person you are missing is not fully real. They are half memory, half imagination. And that is where the suffering becomes endless. Because how do you let go of something that never truly existed in the first place? Think about a simple situation. You are scrolling through old photos late at night. You see a smile, a trip, a message that once made your heart race. And suddenly your mind says, that was real love. But what your mind forgets is everything that came after, the arguments you justified, the disrespect you normalized, the emotional distance you called just a phase. Nietzsche once warned that humans often choose comforting illusions over painful truths, and heartbreak exposes that weakness brutally, because when the illusion breaks, reality feels like betrayal. But the truth is, reality was always there. You just weren't ready to see it. And this is where everything starts to shift. Because the real pain is not that they changed. It is that you finally see them clearly. And clarity always feels like loss at first. But what if that loss is actually the beginning of freedom? What if the version of them you are grieving was never meant to stay? And if that is true, then the question becomes even more unsettling. Who were you when you were loving something that wasn't real? Hold that question, Because the next chapter goes deeper than love. It goes into attachment, and attachment is where most people get trapped for years without even realizing it. There is a moment after heartbreak where the mind starts bargaining. You can fix this. They will come back. It wasn't that bad. And you believe it is love speaking. But it is not love. It is withdrawal. And that is the part nobody talks about. Because emotionally, heartbreak behaves like addiction. Your brain was used to their messages, their attention, their unpredictability, the emotional highs and sudden lows. And now that it is gone, your nervous system does not feel peace. It feels emptiness. Viktor Frankl once said that when meaning collapses, the human mind will attach itself to suffering just to feel alive. And that is exactly what happens after love ends. You don't miss them. You miss the chemical pattern they created inside you. And here's the strange truth. Sometimes the relationship that hurt you the most becomes the one your mind craves the most. Because intensity feels like meaning. Even if it was toxic, even if it was unstable, even if it broke you slowly. Think about how many people return to relationships they know will hurt them again. And when asked why, they say, "I just can't let go." But here's what most people never realize. They are not attached to the person. They are attached to emotional stimulation. Seneca once wrote that humans suffer more in imagination than in reality. But in heartbreak, imagination becomes dependency. You replay their voice in your head like a song you cannot stop listening to. You check their social media even when you know it will hurt you. You revisit old messages like a ritual. And every action gives you a small hit of emotional familiarity. Even pain becomes familiar. And familiar feels like home. That is the trap. But at first, this makes no sense. Why would something painful feel comforting? Because the brain does not seek happiness, it seeks predictability, and even chaos can become predictable if repeated long enough. This is where most people get stuck for years, not because they still love the person, but because they have not detoxed from the emotional addiction. And until that happens, healing cannot even begin. But here is where something important shifts. Because once you see it as addiction, you stop romanticizing it. And once you stop romanticizing it, you start seeing the truth behind the craving. And the truth is uncomfortable. You were not losing love. You were losing stimulation. And there is a massive difference between the two. But understanding this opens another question. If what you felt was partly addiction, then what is real love supposed to feel like? And to understand that, we have to go deeper into identity, because heartbreak does not just affect your emotions. It reshapes who you believe you are, and that is where the real transformation begins. After heartbreak, something subtle happens. You stop being who you were, not externally, but internally. Your confidence shifts. Your thoughts become heavier. Your future feels uncertain, and you start asking questions you never asked before. Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? What do they have that I don't? And without realizing it, you begin reconstructing your identity around loss. Epictetus once taught that it is not events that disturb us, but the meaning we assign to them. And heartbreak is nothing but meaning overload. You turn one ending into a global judgment about yourself. But here's what most people never realize. Every relationship does not just end a connection. It ends a version of you, the version that believed in it, the version that tried harder, the version that ignored warning signs, the version that thought love alone was enough. And that version does not come back, at least not in the same form. And this is why heartbreak feels like death, because something actually dies. Not the relationship, but the identity attached to it. Think about it. You are not just missing them. You are missing who you were when you were with them, the way you laughed differently, the way you imagined the future, the way you believed in something bigger than reality. And now that version is gone. Nietzsche once said, "You must become who you are." But before becoming, there is destruction, and heartbreak is one of the most brutal forms of that destruction. But here is the hidden truth. Not all destruction is loss. Some of it is removal of illusions, removal of dependency, removal of identities built on attachment rather than truth. And this is where transformation begins, because when one identity collapses, another begins to form. But only if you stop trying to resurrect what is already gone. Most people fail here. They try to rebuild the same version of themselves that was built around the relationship. But life does not allow repetition after awakening. It forces evolution. And evolution always begins with discomfort. Which leads to the final question. If heartbreak destroys who you were, then who are you becoming now? The answer to that is not immediate. It unfolds in silence, in loneliness, in the moments you do not post, in the nights you do not explain, and in the quiet realization that you are still here, even after everything you thought would break you. And that leads us into the final chapter, where heartbreak stops being loss and starts becoming power. There comes a point where remembering them no longer feels like pain. It feels like distance, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped returning to the illusion. And this is where everything changes, because healing is not when you forget someone. Healing is when you no longer need the story you built around them. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle becomes the way, and heartbreak is exactly that. It feels like an ending, but it is actually a confrontation with truth. And truth, once accepted, removes suffering faster than time ever could. At first, this feels impossible, because how do you transform something that broke you? But here's what most people never realize. You were never broken. You were reshaped. Think about a river changing its path after hitting a rock. It does not stop flowing. It adapts. And adaptation is intelligence, not weakness. And slowly, something shifts inside you. You stop checking. You stop waiting. You stop imagining conversations that will never happen. And in that silence, you meet yourself again. Not the version shaped by love, not the version shaped by loss, but the version that exists beyond both. And that version is stronger than anything you have known before, because it is no longer dependent on being chosen. It is built on understanding. Understanding that love is not possession, that connection is not control, that endings are not failures, they are transitions. And when you finally see that, the emotional weight lifts, not all at once, but gradually, like a storm moving away from a quiet landscape. And what remains is clarity, and clarity is power, because now, when you think of them, you no longer feel pulled backward, you feel awake. And that awakening changes everything. You begin to realize that the real lesson was never about them. It was about you, your patterns, your attachments, your illusions, your expectations. And once those are seen clearly, they cannot control you anymore. This is where Stoic philosophy meets modern psychology. This is where Buddha's idea of detachment becomes practical. This is where Frankl's meaning replaces suffering. And this is where your life quietly begins again, not as it was, but as something new, something honest, something real. And now we arrive at the final truth, the one most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Heartbreak was never about losing someone. It was about losing the version of yourself that believed the illusion, and that loss was necessary, because without it, you would still be living inside a story that was never meant to last. The mind always tries to return to comfort, but growth does not exist in comfort. It exists in truth. And truth is simple. People change. Feelings fade. illusions collapse, and nothing in human attachment is permanent. But you are still here, and that is the part you keep forgetting. You survived what you thought would destroy you. You outlived the version of yourself that could not imagine life without them, and now you stand in a place they no longer occupy, not because you pushed them out, but because you outgrew the emotional space they once filled, and that realization changes everything. Because now, love is no longer confusion, it is awareness. Connection is no longer dependency, it is choice. And memory is no longer pain, it is distance. Marcus Aurelius would call this acceptance of impermanence. Buddha would call it release from attachment. Nietzsche would call it becoming. But for you, it is simpler than philosophy. It is peace, not loud peace, not dramatic peace, but the quiet kind, the kind that does not need explanation, the kind that does not chase closure, the kind that simply understands. What left was never meant to stay in that form forever, and what remains is you, finally whole in a way you never expected. Not because you got everything back, but because you stopped needing it, and that is the brutal truth about heartbreak nobody wants to hear. But once you do, you never experience love the same way again.